Hi everyone, it's Tammy Sharrow, and today we're going to be talking about the adolescent population and some of their significant health risks. And within this, we've kind of weaved in a focus on chronic illness and sort of life-threatening illness as well, and that whole transition to self-care and adulthood. So I want to start by just thinking about adolescence and what are some of the major growth and developmental changes during this time. We know there's a rapid changes in growth, so growth spurts, physical growth, and often what comes with that is an increased need for sleep. Sexual maturation, development of secondary sex characteristics. There's the development of cognitively abstract logical thinking, deductive reasoning, development of identity, and sort of that self-concept. And often when that doesn't happen, role confusion can result, according to Erikson. So they have a new understanding of short and long-term consequences, but they still have that teenage brain, which we're going to look at in a little bit. Peer pressure is big during this time, and if adolescents are different or they struggle with fitting in, that can create a lot of stress for them. A lot of risk-taking behavior around smoking, alcohol, drugs, sex, and so it's a really important time to from a healthcare perspective, is to promote independence in care and promote them taking on more responsibility as they transition to adulthood. They often become very future focused at this time, and so things like a health setback or chronic illness can often interrupt that. So just speaking a little bit about the teen brain, I uploaded on Blackboard a fun video that really looks at the teen brain. And historically, we thought that teens really, their brain was, developed to adult capacity. But what we've come to realize is that the brain is not fully developed until almost age 25. And one of the parts not developed is the frontal lobe, which is really involved with decision making, and hence the the fact that adolescents often get involved in risk-taking behavior. They're not always thinking about long-term implications and not always making the best decisions. So when we look at the World Health Organization and on a sort of global perspective, and we look at adolescent health risks, certainly early pregnancy and childbirth is a global concern. Luckily, locally, our teenage pregnancy rates are dropping, but our HIV and STD rates are increasing. Across the world, we see issues with malnutrition in adolescents. This is often a time when eating disorders can develop, to the point where we see the development of obesity. So there's a few times in life when you can increase not only the size of your fat cells, but the number of your fat cells. And adolescence is one of those times. So if a adolescent becomes obese, it's harder for them to turn that around in their adult life. Lots of mental health concerns, anxiety, depression, stress, are frequent during adolescence as they transition through this sort of precarious time of their life. When we look at risk-taking behaviors, some of the health risks are around alcohol use, tobacco use, and cannabis use. So, cannabis use is high in Canada. It's now legal. And so what are the implications for that from an adolescent health perspective? We have an increased violence in our society that impacts adolescents, and we have new drivers and lots of distractions on the road, and so injuries and road safety and driving safety is a really important thing to think about. I did want to touch on adolescent sexuality. So when we think about sexuality and sexual health, how do we define that? Often we speak of adolescent sex and sexuality. We focus on what adults don't want young people to do, but sexuality is a normal, positive, lifelong aspect of health and well-being, and it really encompasses more than certain particular behaviors. And so healthy adolescent sexual development involves not only bodily changes, but sexual behaviors, new healthcare needs, and it involves building emotional maturity, relationship skills, and a healthy body image. So, what does it mean to be a sexually healthy adolescent? It could mean I am comfortable with my body and my sexuality. I can talk effectively with my peers, my family, my partners. I know my body and how it functions. I understand the risks, responsibilities, and consequences of sexual health and sexual behavior. I'm able to recognize risks and ways to reduce them. I know how to access and use healthcare services. I can set boundaries, I act responsibly, and I'm able to form and maintain healthy relationships. So there was an interesting study done in Toronto with adolescents specifically. It was called Sex Press Toronto. It was a participatory action research where they actually involved adolescents as part of the data gathering team. And what they found was, this is relating to an urban center in Canada, but you can sort of expand this to, any sort of urban center across the country, that teens are sexually active in a variety of ways. There's a disconnect between what youth or teens are learning and what they really want to know. Most teens have never accessed clinical sexual health care. They often get most of their information from the internet or their friends. And teens accessing clinical sexual health care are often unhappy with the care they receive. And actually, 8% aren't getting any sexual education at all. And so what's interesting around sexual health with adolescents is that a specific group carry the greatest burden of poor sexual health in Canada. And that includes adolescents living in poverty or having no fixed address, living on the street, couch surfing, that type of thing. Rural adolescents, Indigenous adolescents, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, two-spirited, or queer adolescents. So those carry the greatest burden and the greatest health alterations around sexual health. So we're going to use the textbook, and I'm going to have you turn to page 347 in your textbook and read the clinical scenario about Kim, a young 16-year-old adolescent who comes for information about birth control. So read the scenario, appreciate the context of it, and then I encourage you to turn to page 364 at the end of that same chapter on adolescent health and answer the questions about Kim. And the answers are also available in the appendix, but it raises a lot of interesting questions around adolescent health, specifically around sexuality, but also around the growth and developmental aspects that are happening during this time. Okay, let's dive a little bit into chronic illness and thinking about, this isn't a new topic for you. You've been exposed to chronic illness in the past. So let's think about it from a child health or pediatric perspective, what are the characteristics of disorders that you consider chronic? And so some of the characteristics are that it's long-term, it's ongoing, it often requires adaptation to daily living. It could be visible, so children might look different, but it can be invisible, and as in the case of, say, asthma or diabetes. It can interfere with the child's ability to fully participate in school and society. Some might even require specialized care or technology in the home setting, extra equipment. It can impact growth. It could impact development. And chronic illnesses and diseases are usually of slower progression and long duration. And certainly the prevalence of chronic illness is increasing worldwide. So on a worldwide basis, the World Health Organization reports that chronic diseases are responsible for 60% of global disease burden, so a lot more than acute. And in Canada specifically, the costs incurred related to illness, disability, and death due to chronic disease is over 80 billion, so a huge amount of money annually. Prevalence in children, about 20% or 1 in 5 have a chronic illness of some sort, and that could include, cystic fibrosis, it could include asthma, it could include diabetes, it could include, a disability that the child was born with, etc. So when we look at adolescent developmental milestones, some of the things we talked about earlier, we need to think about adolescence as a stage of really profound physical, psychological, and physical change. And so if you think about the adolescent with a chronic illness, what additional or numerous challenges might they face? What might some of them be? And one of the big things is differences and fitting in. Peer pressure is so huge in adolescence, and everybody wants to be part of the crowd and fit in, etc. But in this case, some of these kids may struggle with that. Adherence to their medical regime, medications, the health activities that help keep them symptom-free, some of those things can fall off during adolescence, and sometimes adolescents aren't always compliant with their healthcare strategies. You want to think about risk-taking behaviors and how that could impact a chronic illness. So the adolescent who wants to experience, the adolescent with asthma who wants to experiment with vaping or smoking or, smoking weed, something like that. So we often have to balance that notion of those risk-taking behaviors with the impact on health. And then another big thing is this notion of transition and their need to increase their own independence to be able to manage their illness as they move forward to adulthood. A lot of times, parents take a huge responsibility for managing chronic illnesses, and now it's a time to turn those tables. So there was a really interesting study done in 2008, and it looked at the experience of living with a chronic illness during adolescence, and it was a critical review of the literature. It looked at a huge number of studies and tried to sort of summarize what the ultimate themes were in relation to this. And some of them, the themes that this study identified was developing and maintaining friendships can be challenging when you're an adolescent with chronic illness. So you might not be able to partake in some activities. You might miss school. You might not be able to spend as much time with your peers. The notion of being normal and getting on with life. Sometimes their chronic illness stood in the road of that. They didn't feel normal, and they felt that there was barriers or hurdles to certain things that they wanted to experience or accomplish. They did talk a lot about the importance of family and the importance of family in caring for them historically and then supporting them in moving forward. Their whole attitude to treatment had a big impact on their ability to be successful living with a chronic illness. If they weren't compliant with their treatment, or they saw it as a burden, sometimes they'd experience more health issues and setbacks. Experiences at school, often there could be opportunities where they would be away from school, miss school. They might have academic difficulties. They might feel socially isolated, and that was all in relation to their specific chronic illness. They talked a lot about the profound strength of their relationships with their healthcare professionals. Often, if these kids were diagnosed with a chronic illness at a young age, they've been followed by the same healthcare professionals, the same pediatrician. They might be going to the same outpatient clinic. And those relationships over time can be very, very strong, and they can provide a lot of support to the adolescent. The healthcare team understands them, and they focus on them as an individual rather than their illness. A big struggle is this notion of being future focused. So for some kids with a chronic illness, they might have to face the reality of death, that they might not live the length of life that they would like to. They have concerns about employment. What is the best job for me to choose based on my chronic illness? They often can be concerned about moving away from home, deciding to get married, have children, etc. So they might feel that they could be discriminated against as an employee. And so the whole notion of future focus, which is big in adolescence, what am I going to do with my life? What do I want to be when I grow up, etc., can be more challenging for these kids. So some of the crisis points that can occur in children that experience a chronic illness certainly is when there's illness exacerbations. When the chronic illness is well controlled and everything's going along sort of tickety-boo, and then they have a setback. So a good example of this would be an adolescent living with cystic fibrosis who encounters a pulmonary infection and has to be readmitted to hospital. So, second point, hospitalizations. Time away from school, time away from their peers, and often that can be a huge crisis point. When developmental milestones don't occur, so certainly with some chronic illnesses, it might affect your growth. It might affect your cognitive development, might affect your physical development. And so when developmental milestones don't occur, that could be a crisis point. Moving and relocation. So if we look back at some of the experience, how they struggle with, school, struggle to develop friendships and relationships. They have a strong healthcare team supporting them, and now they're moving and relocating. And all of those things will change. A lot of times during the trajectory of chronic illness, there's times when new treatments and new problems arise requiring new treatments. So you're the child with cystic fibrosis or the adolescent who develops diabetes, or develops some sort of, you're a diabetic who develops circulatory issues. You're an asthmatic who develops particular, respiratory issues. So all new problems and new treatments are considered crisis points. So when we look at our family-centered care model and the notion of what contributes to that, the 4 components in the outside of the circle: information sharing, dignity and respect, collaboration, and involvement in decision making. So we often need to remember these 4 foundations of family-centered care and think about how we'd apply these when working with families of chronically ill children. So even if you step back from adolescence, think about clinical experiences you've had working with families of children with chronic illness and how these components or concepts of family-centered care we might approach differently. And thinking about what responses might you expect from a family. So when you're thinking about, I'll use the example of decision making, a family of a child with a chronic illness has been embedded in this chronic illness often for years, and they have been probably actively involved with their care of their child, and they are actively involved in decision making, different than a parent who just arrives with a child with an acute illness. Stressors on the family: certainly having a child with a chronic illness places great demands on the parents. And when we think about some of the specific stressors on the family, some of the research would say is initially obviously learning about the child's condition, learning about technical aspects of care, medications, etc. Some of that over time can contribute to caregiver burden or something we call chronic sorrow, where parents are just sad and upset that their child isn't able to live what they would consider a normal life. One of the stressors is finding ways each family member can help and contribute. There's lots of communication with healthcare professionals. There can be significant financial issues. Maybe one parent has to stay at home with the child, or there might be additional equipment or medication that isn't covered. How do parents continue employment? The role strain around that. Siblings. The little picture shows the siblings supporting their brother or sister with their chronic illness. Often, how do you provide a normal life for one child and provide, intense care and support to another child? You may have to welcome strangers into your home to help provide care. There can be lots of coping strategies required with exacerbations, hospitalization, uncertainty, not knowing when the chronic illness might, become more complicated, that there could be new problems or new medications or new treatments. Ultimately with life-threatening chronic illnesses, in the case of cystic fibrosis or muscular dystrophy, there's this fear of potential loss of the child. And what's really interesting, there's often high marital discord in families with a child with a chronic illness. So some of the evidence-based practice: parents having a child with a chronic or complex healthcare condition have reported difficulties, often in obtaining the support that they need to manage their child's care. And the needs of these families really are varied and different, and they really depend on the diagnosis, the prognosis, and the specific needs of the child. Some certainly more demanding than others, but generally parents find that they just do not have the support and resources that they need. So I just want you to think about a chronic illness. So choose a chronic illness that usually requires the parents to follow a complex routine to care for their child, and thinking about constructing a series of questions that you would ask the family in order to learn about their perceived needs. What is their lived experience currently caring for this child? and consider sort of potential supports and services and resources the family might need. So we might want to start with, a strength-based approach and ask them, what things are going well? What do you find most challenging? What is the impact of your child's illness on you as parents or on the family as a whole? What specific needs are unmet? What supports or resources might you need? And always raising the notion of financial support. So some of the coping strategies around chronic illness with families is a lot of families assign meaning to the illness. So they look at the illness and say, there is a reason that this child was born into our family. We have the resources, we have the capability, we have the intelligence, we have what it takes to be able to care for this child. There was a reason this child was born into our family. Sharing the burden. So all family members contributing to the specific function of the family and the care of the child. Downward comparisons is a really interesting one. I see this a lot in the neonatal intensive care unit where the notion is basically that you think about it could be worse. So you look at another child with cystic fibrosis or cerebral palsy, or you look at your baby who's 30 weeks and you look at the 23-weeker beside you in the incubator, and you compare to worse situations to cope with your own situation. Certainly parent and peer networks and social support is really critical. A lot of clinics that deal with kids with chronic illness have well-developed parent support networks. So, for example, kids with congenital heart defects, the cardiology clinic, Heartbeats is a well-known parent support network. However, parents can increase control with schedule and routines, can really help their coping strategies so that they have a plan, they know when treatments or medications are due or when follow-up is due. And so by increasing control, that helps them cope. And probably one of the biggest ones, and the one that the literature speaks to the most, is this notion of normalization. So it's about outlook. And it kind of relates to a little bit to assigning meaning. But when parents have the outlook, that this child with chronic illness living in their family, they normalize it. So the family views whatever goes on in relation to care of this child as it's a normal part of their life. They recognize the serious nature of the illness, but their normal is redefined, and they focus on the normal aspects of life. Family needs are met, and I often provide this clinical example of a family I knew with a child with significant cerebral palsy, wheelchair-bound, nonverbal, and that child went everywhere with them. And I witnessed the mom, giving him an NG feed in the middle of a social situation. They would carry him, they would push that wheelchair wherever. That child was a part of their family, and his chronic illness was normalized. This is the way we do life. This is normal for us. So nursing interventions for common family stressors. One of the biggest one is honesty and advocacy, that notion of listening. Sometimes we just need to hear the family story. We don't often have a solution, but we can provide that empathy and that understanding and that listening ear. Providing them commendations, so talking with families about their strengths, about what's going well, and that is often a great place to start. Providing resources to help with coordination of care, providing them information and about resources, specifically financial resources, can be really helpful, thereby addressing costs with the family. You know, you think about a electronic wheelchair with all the bells and whistles. How are you going to get that? How are you going to pay for it? How are you going to get wheelchair access to your home? All those types of things. Encouraging parent support through support groups, and also care of the siblings. Sometimes some of these chronic illness clinics have programs for siblings as well. And then this notion of transition to self-care in adulthood. Some chronic illnesses that might be easier in, some it might not even be a possibility.